Hello, this video is in response to Module 3 scenario in which there are two groups. One is a marginalized community who experience risk related to low income or pretty much the same type of risk that exists in impoverished communities. And then you have Group 1, which is an disaster affected community that do not have the same underlying conditions as Group 2. So in the scenario, the resources are limited and a decision is needed on which group to prioritize. So in the scenario A, Group 2 is not yet affected by the disaster, although they have protracted risk due to the underlying conditions mentioned earlier for that group. So Group 1 has been able to manage the disaster response pretty effectively and consistently. However, there is a risk for gaps being created that may cause displacement of people within Group 1 and essentially recategorize them as a Group 2 individual. So in this case, in this scenario, my response, I would prioritize Group 1 to stop the bleeding before it becomes Group 2's problem, as Group 2 is already experiencing protracted risk associated with marginalization, poverty, and displacement from essential resources. Since some, so that it does not, to prevent it from bleeding into Group 2's already critical situation. So since some gaps are beginning to appear as the crisis drags on and more people are needing to stay in collective shelters, which are starting to run low on supplies, the crisis threatens imminent risk of individual migration from category Group 1 to category Group 2, which would cause further strain on the standing resources that are available to Group 2. So if Group 2 have, if they rely on community resources, or community aid, or community assistance, things of that nature, if people from Group 1 are being displaced as a effect to, or in as a consequence of the disaster, then they're going to have to share those resources with these new individuals. So since humanitarian resources are limited, focusing resources on development efforts for Group 2 may only provide temporary relief to their condition. However, failing to close up the gaps can lead to protracted displacement for even more individuals. So individuals from Group 1, rotating members from Group 1 to Group 2 as efforts that are directed at moving Group 2 individuals to Group 1 status, essentially. So pretty much what's going to happen is individuals are going to be getting recycled out. So if the resources are focused towards developmental efforts for Group 2, while members are pretty much being developed from Group 2 into Group 1 status, people from Group 1 are going to be falling into Group 2 status, pretty much recycling the protracted condition rather than meeting the intent of developmental relief. So, in other words, it would be in vain. Focusing on, well, to an extent. So, focusing on the threshold of these gaps can also provide frameworks for developmental efforts of bridging the gaps between Group 1 and Group 2. So, learning experience. So, focusing the resources on addressing those gaps before they bleed over into Group 2's circumstance can actually offer a framework into bridging gaps between Group 2 and Group 1, allowing more individuals to move from their Group 2 status into the Group 1 status. So in scenario B, Group 2 has yet. Scenario B, same disaster and group from scenario A. However, now the crisis has grown and there are clear gaps in the response to Group 1, and more members of Group 1 are not able to meet basic needs. The crisis is not also starting. The crisis is now also starting to impact Group 2, while Group 1 is still more directly affected. Group 2 is beginning to be affected, exacerbating their pre-existing vulnerabilities. So, in this case, kind of the same sentiment in addressing the gaps. So, where the disaster is affecting both groups, there should be the focus and the prioritization, the gap. So, of course, within that gap, within the Venn diagram, so Group A, Group B, right, and then right there in the middle you have the gap. Within that gap, members of the Group 2, members of groups associated with Group 2 should have priority, since they have pre-existing or protracted risk that exists even without the disaster. So, and then in that prioritization, there should be a secondary prioritization that categorize at-risk Group 1 individuals. So, Group 1 individuals who are at risk of displacement, right? So the displacement, which is acute compared to Group 2's condition. So in this case, that's why Group 2 is being prioritized. Now, in addition to that, Group 1 should be recategorized as, based off their level of risk for displacement. So essentially, even if for a time being becoming a Group 2 member, so that category of individuals could be recategorized as Group 1B or Group 2B. So the priority would be of that Venn diagram. The priority starts in the gap, so affected by the disaster. Group 2 has the priority. Group 1 members who are at risk of displacement have a recategorization pretty much into Group 2 status. So that focus is still pretty much within the gap, only with a little bit more recategorization. So, and then on the other end, Group 2 individuals are recategorized as being affected by the disaster or not being affected by the disaster, right? So a Group 1 individual who is at imminent risk of displacement may have priority over a Group 2 individual who has not been affected by the disaster at all, if that makes sense. So that is how I would go about it. I think that addressing the gaps could, I think that it could offer relief as well as a smoother transition into like developmental efforts. So that's my response.